Welcome to our deep dive, into the fascinating world of reproductive ethics.
Oh, yeah.
You've given us some really interesting philosophical excerpts to work with.
Absolutely.
They really dig into the, moral status of the fetus
Right.
and all the different ethical considerations surrounding ways to help people who are dealing with infertility.
Right.
So we're here to sort of unpack these really complex issues
Excellent.
and hopefully help you kind of navigate these different viewpoints and these different arguments.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me how these sources go beyond that simple pro-choice versus pro-life.
Right.
They really get into the gray areas and push us to, examine our own assumptions about the whole thing.
Yeah, right from the start, your sources jump into this debate about the moral status of the fetus.
Yeah.
And they kind of present us with this spectrum of beliefs.
Yeah.
Ranging from the idea of, full personhood at the moment of conception to the view that a fetus is simply part of a woman's body.
Yeah. And what's so crucial is that your sources demonstrate the challenges inherent in each of these positions.
Right.
Like, for instance, the conservative stance of, full personhood at conception leads to some really tricky dilemmas.
Right.
One of your sources asks us to imagine having to choose between saving a newborn baby and a 2-day-old embryo.
Okay.
And if they have equal moral status,
Right.
how could you possibly make that decision?
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
And then on the other end of the spectrum, the idea that a fetus is merely part of a woman's body
Right.
could, as one of your sources points out, be used to justify infanticide.
Yeah.
Which is something that, most people would find morally reprehensible.
Absolutely.
So.
And it's not like the middle ground offers an easy solution either.
Right.
Your sources delve into these
Yeah.
moderate views and gradualist views, and even the potentiality view, which argues that a fetus deserves, special consideration because it has the potential to become a person.
Right.
But even this raises more questions than answers.
One of the things that really struck me was how one of your sources quotes the philosopher Michael Tooley,
Yes.
who challenges this whole idea that fetuses and even infants
Right.
have a right to life at all.
That's a pretty radical
Yeah,
argument.
it's a very controversial argument,
Yeah.
but it really forces us to kind of think about
Right.
what are the underlying criteria for what constitutes personhood.
Exactly.
And so Tooley argues that, self-awareness,
Yeah.
this desire to continue existing,
Oh.
are key
Right.
to having a right to life.
Yeah.
And since fetuses and infants may lack this, they don't meet his criteria
Interesting.
for personhood.
Yeah, it's important to note, though, that none of these views on, fetal moral status have unassailable arguments. And that's exactly why this debate is so complex and continues.
Okay, so we've got this really, challenging question of the fetus's moral status.
Right.
And then your sources throw embryonic and fetal research into the mix.
Well, yeah.
Which adds this whole other layer of complexity.
That's right. This is where the advancement of in vitro fertilization and all the potential medical breakthroughs using fetal tissue really come into play.
Yeah.
The ethical considerations around abortion are all intertwined with these questions about using embryos and fetuses to potentially save lives or to push the boundaries of our scientific understanding.
One of the things that really kind of stood out to me was this apparent inconsistency in a lot of places where we have, relatively liberal abortion laws, but then very strict regulations surrounding embryo research.
Yeah.
So how do we reconcile those two seemingly
That's a good question.
conflicting stances?
It's a question a lot of people are wrestling with. One perspective that your sources suggest is that these liberal abortion laws are sort of a necessary compromise to prevent unsafe practices and hardship for women.
Yeah.
Of course, that doesn't fully address the concerns of those who believe in the full moral status of the fetus from the moment of conception.
And this brings us to the issue of a woman's right to choose.
Right.
One of your sources highlighted this really interesting argument from Judith Jarvis Thompson.
Oh, yes.
And it's fascinating how she kind of shifts the focus away from the fetus and onto the woman's body.
She argues that even if we accept that a fetus has a right to life, that doesn't automatically mean that it has a right to use another person's body for survival, especially without their consent. She uses this really interesting thought experiment that I think is quite compelling. Imagine that you're involuntarily connected to a famous violinist who needs to use your body for 9 months in order to survive. Would you be morally obligated to remain connected?
I think most people would say no to that.
So her point is that an unwanted pregnancy has some, striking parallels to that scenario. It forces us to really confront the unique nature of pregnancy and its impact on a woman's body. And of course, no analogy is perfect. Some people have criticized her approach. But it does raise some really important questions about bodily autonomy and the right to choose.
And then things get even more complicated when we move into the realm of assisted reproduction. Aid, IVF, surrogacy.
All these different methods.
All these different methods that kind of shift the ethical spotlight away from the fetus and onto these questions of parenthood and family structures.
And it's interesting how your sources highlight how assisted reproduction brings up all these issues of rights and ownership that we haven't really grappled with before. For example, who has rights to embryos created through IVF? And what happens if a surrogacy agreement falls apart?
And you pointed out earlier that some conservative viewpoints find IVF morally problematic because of the creation of spare embryos.
Exactly. Because if an embryo is a person, then what happens to all those embryos? It's a real ethical dilemma.
It's a huge ethical dilemma.
With no easy answers.
And then there's surrogacy. Which has generated a lot of debate.
So much debate.
Even within feminist thought.
Absolutely.
On the one hand, there's this argument that, a woman should have complete control over her own body. And that includes the right to be a surrogate. But then there are concerns about exploitation and the commodification of women's bodies.
Absolutely.
Especially, when surrogacy involves financial compensation.
It's this constant balancing act between individual rights and these broader concerns about social justice.
It's a really, tricky area.
Your sources really delve into the potential for harm. Especially when these surrogacy agreements break down. Which unfortunately does happen. When a surrogacy agreement falls apart, it raises this really basic question, like, who should get the child? Your sources explore some of the different arguments that have been used to try to determine the outcome in these cases. One is this idea of prenatal adoption, where the commissioning couple is considered the legal parents from the moment of conception.
So that's interesting because it seems like it gives more weight to the intention to the agreement and to the biological connection of pregnancy and childbirth.
Exactly.
Some of your sources also bring up the idea of ownership based on the gametes. Whose egg was used.
Whose egg, whose sperm.
And whether they retained any right.
Exactly. And then, of course, you can't forget the argument that the surrogate mother mixes her labor with the child by carrying and giving birth. But the problem is, like your sources point out, all of these approaches sort of seem to prioritize certain aspects of reproduction while kind of downplaying others. It doesn't always lead to a clear or easy resolution.
It seems like trying to dissect this process of reproduction and assign ownership based on these very specific biological or legal technicalities kind of misses a really big piece of the puzzle.
And that piece, as your sources really emphasize, is the welfare of the child. It becomes this central ethical consideration, especially in those really tough situations where surrogacy agreements fall apart and you have multiple parties who want custody of the child.
Your sources make a really compelling case that a child benefits from that, natural bond that is formed through pregnancy and childbirth.
And they also stress the importance of a child knowing their genetic parents. And so this raises questions about, could severing those connections potentially harm the child.
And these arguments are especially powerful in cases where the surrogate mother and her partner decide they want to keep the child. It's not just about legal contracts anymore. It's about those deep emotional connections that are forged through the experience of pregnancy and birth.
And it's not just surrogacy that raises these kinds of concerns. Your sources kind of broaden the discussion to include the potential for any method of alleviating infertility to bring a child into the world who might be disadvantaged in some way.
There's this argument, for example, that using IVF or donor sperm is unnatural and that it introduces a third party into the family, which could be detrimental to the child.
But, you know, the desire to have a child
is such a natural thing.
Absolutely.
And family is so important.
Of course.
To just dismiss all of these methods as unnatural seems to kind of overlook the very real and valid longing for family that so many people experience.
It's a really tricky balance. Because we want to acknowledge and respect that really fundamental human desire for a child.
But as your sources point out, that desire shouldn't automatically justify any and all means to achieve it. So there's got to be an ethical line somewhere, right?
Absolutely.
We can't just prioritize the desires of adults without considering the impact on the children.
The children who are brought into the world through these different methods.
This leads us into another fascinating area of discussion, which is the whole role of genetics and the responsibilities of parents. One of the most thought-provoking issues that your sources raise is this recent debate about using ova from aborted fetuses. I mean, it raises some really uncomfortable questions.
It does.
What would it mean for a child to know that their biological mother was a fetus?
That's mind-blowing.
I mean, what are the psychological implications of that? It's a pretty mind-bending concept.
One way to approach this, as your sources suggest, is to consider that we're talking about the choice between a very specific form of existence and non-existence for that child. It's not about choosing between different types of mothers. It's about whether that child will have the opportunity to exist at all.
That's a helpful way to frame it. It kind of takes it out of the realm of, you know, comparing mothers and forces us to confront this really fundamental question of existence. And speaking of different types of mothers, your sources also touch on more common practices like egg donation, embryo donation, and artificial insemination.
All of which have become increasingly accepted.
But they're not without their ethical complexities.
They're not.
For example, you shared this news story about this doctor who used his own sperm
Yeah, that was a disturbing one.
to fertilize his patients' eggs.
Yeah, without their knowledge or consent.
I mean, that case really shook people's trust in the system.
It did.
It raised some really serious concerns about informed consent and the power dynamics in that doctor-patient relationship.
And it makes you wonder what other ethical violations might be lurking beneath the surface of these seemingly acceptable practices.
And then there's the issue of, you know, societal judgments that are passed on certain groups of people who choose to have children. You know, older mothers, individuals who carry certain genes.
They often face a lot of scrutiny.
Yeah, they face a lot of scrutiny.
And criticism.
And so it raises questions about what we consider to be responsible parenthood and who gets to make those judgments.
That's a good question.
It's a slippery slope.
It is.
When we start dictating who should and shouldn't have children based on factors like age or genetics.
Absolutely. And this ties in directly to the whole debate about genetic screening and abortion.
If a test reveals a genetic abnormality, what are the ethical implications of a woman's decision to continue or terminate the pregnancy?
Your sources remind us that a woman's reasons for refusing screening or for choosing not to have an abortion can be very complex and deeply personal.
It might be based on her own experience with disability, her religious beliefs,
her values,
all sorts of factors.
So many factors.
It's not always a simple case of, you know, selfishness or irresponsibility.
It's much more nuanced than that.
It seems like we tend to oversimplify these decisions and reduce them to these black and white choices when in reality there's this whole spectrum of gray areas.
And it's so crucial to acknowledge those nuances and complexities.
One of your sources even suggests that within the context of the abortion debate, specifically for those who hold this conservative view of fetal personhood, there may be situations where fetal euthanasia could be ethically justifiable.
That's a pretty heavy concept.
It is a really heavy concept. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
So the key distinction, according to this perspective, is the motivation behind the decision. If the goal is to prevent suffering for a fetus with a severe abnormality that's incompatible with life, that's viewed very differently than, say, wanting a designer baby with specific traits.
But as we discussed earlier, it's really hard to legislate intent.
That's right. How do you write laws that can distinguish between a genuine desire to prevent suffering and just callous disregard for life?
That's one of the most challenging aspects of all of this.
It really is. And it brings us to this crucial point that your sources make, that we often kind of blur the lines between morality and legislation. We assume that if something is morally wrong, it should be illegal. But in this world of reproductive ethics, things are rarely that straightforward.
There's sometimes that focus on the legal framework can make us lose sight of the human element.
The very personal and often difficult decisions that individuals and families are facing.
Your sources actually kind of critique this tendency to fixate on rights
and legal frameworks.
And legal frameworks in these discussions. They argue that this narrow focus can obscure these deeper moral dimensions that operate within families.
Because after all, most reproductive decisions aren't made in courtrooms. They're made in the context of loving relationships through conversations. And, soul searching with a desire to be good parents and to do the right thing.
It's so easy to get caught up in the theoretical arguments and to forget that these are real people's lives and hopes and dreams.
It's not just about abstract principles.
It's about the messy.
It's about the messy,
complicated realities of human relationships.
And the longing to create a family.
Wow, it feels like we've just been on this incredible journey through the ethical landscape of reproduction.
We have.
And your sources have really illuminated the path for us.
You've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, we have. From the
day.
very foundations of fetal moral status to the complexities of assisted reproduction to, this whole evolving concept of parental responsibility.
It's clear that these aren't simple issues with easy answers.
It's amazing to me how much depth there is to all of this.
It is.
It would be easy to just kind of skim the surface and, stick with the familiar talking points. But your sources really push us to think critically and to really consider all these different angles.
And that's the beauty of a deep dive like this. You really get to kind of delve into the nuances and complexities.
Acknowledge the gray areas.
Yes.
And move beyond those kind of polarized positions that we see so often.
Absolutely.
Out of everything that we've talked about, what stands out to you as maybe the most challenging?
That's a good question.
For the most crucial aspect of all of this?
For me, it's this constant tension between individual rights and the well-being of future generations. Your sources bring up this idea over and over again, that we need to find this balance between respecting autonomy and making sure that our choices don't create undue harm or disadvantage for the children who are going to inherit the world that we're creating.
That is a really important point.
Especially today, as these reproductive technologies just keep advancing.
At such a rapid pace.
It's incredible what we're able to do now.
I know.
Things that, were once considered science fiction. And that raises a whole new set of ethical questions.
So we need to be having these conversations now. Before those technologies become even more widely available so that we can create, some kind of ethical frameworks and guidelines to protect both individuals and society as a whole.
I completely agree.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what is the one thing that you would want our listener to take away from all of this?
I would say the importance of informed and compassionate engagement. Don't shy away from these difficult conversations.
Yeah.
Seek out diverse perspectives.
Right.
Challenge your own assumptions. And approach these issues with empathy.
Yeah.
And a willingness to really understand the complexities.
Because there may not be any easy answers.
There may not be.
But the process of wrestling with these questions is essential.
I think so too.
For, creating a more just and ethical world.
For everyone.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Informed and compassionate engagement.
That's what it's all about.
We can't just bury our heads in the sand and pretend these issues don't exist.
We have to be active participants.
We have to be active participants in shaping the future of reproduction and family.
I completely agree. And as your sources show, it's a future that's filled with both incredible possibilities and these profound ethical challenges.
Yeah. So it's up to us to navigate that future thoughtfully and responsibly.
I think so.
Well, this has been such a fascinating discussion.
It has been.
Thank you so much for joining us and sharing all of your insights.
Oh, it's been my pleasure.
And to our listener, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of reproductive ethics.
Yes.
We hope this has given you a lot to think about.
We encourage you to keep exploring these questions.
And to engage in these conversations.
Yes.
And to advocate for policies that reflect your values.
Absolutely.
Thanks for being with us.